Welcome to the LaChance podcast. Hello, one and all, and welcome to the LaChance podcast. This is the very first episode. This is something I've been thinking about doing for a long time, as I'm a fan of podcasts. I love listening to them. I thought it might be a lot of fun to actually have one. So I'm still working this out. I'm still figuring out some of this new technology, and I hope you'll bear with me as I fumble through. I'll start out just by giving a brief introduction of myself. I'm a full-time political blogger. I write for a well-known website called Legal Insurrection. I've been with them since 2012, which seems amazing to me that it's been that long. I've written for a number of different websites over the years and currently also write for a website called American Lookout, and you can check them both out on the internet. If you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is at MikeLaChance33. That's MikeLaChance33. And I'll thank you to follow me. I usually tweet pretty late at night because that's typically when I finish up my work. Although sometimes I do jump on during the day just to see what's happening in the world. And I'd like to actually start out by talking about something that is on my Twitter feed at the moment. For several months now, I've had a tweet pinned at the top of my Twitter page. And the quote by myself, my own quote, is "Libertarians who live in the real world vote Republican." And the reason why I want to talk about this just for a minute is because I think there's some confusion over that line. Some people look at that and know exactly what I mean, and I don't have to explain it to them at all. Other people look at it and say, "What are you talking about?" So maybe I could just explain. When I was in my mid-30s and sort of had a political awakening, I live in Massachusetts. I've always thought that I was a liberal. I always thought that I was a left-leaning person, and I guess on some things I was, and in a way I was, but in my mid-30s I started to pay more attention to politics and media, and the more I paid attention, and the longer that I paid attention, and the more that I read, the more that I realized that many of the positions that I hold are actually right-leaning positions, or more specifically, libertarian positions. And so the point of the quote that I have there is that if you're a libertarian-minded person, and I'm not even talking about a capital L libertarian who belongs to the Libertarian Party, but just a person who believes in, the smallest government possible and the maximum amount of freedom possible, there's no way you can vote for the Democratic Party. There really isn't. And the live in the real world part has to do with voting libertarian, because libertarian candidates don't usually win. In fact, they often act as spoilers for the Republican. We actually had a case here in Massachusetts several years ago, very highly contested case between three candidates, a Democrat, a Libertarian, and Republican candidate. And the Libertarian candidate got a lot of attention from the media, which is unusual. But the reason was because the Libertarian ended up siphoning off just enough votes from the Republican to hand a win to the Democratic candidate. And that's often what happens if you introduce a libertarian, is that some of those liberty and freedom-minded people who might vote Republican will look at the libertarian candidate and say, "Gee, that person more represents my views on these topics, so I'll vote for that person." But what they end up doing is handing a victory to the Democrat. And so that's the meaning. Another way to describe this actually is through another tweet, which I'll just pull up here. This is such a perfect example. If you spend any time on Twitter, there's a guy you should follow. His handle is @CuffyMeh. Okay, that's @CuffyMeh. And I'm going to set up this scenario for you. So back in March, Pete Buttigieg, who's running as a Democrat, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Pete Buttigieg said on Twitter one day, and there's a video to go with it, he said, "Don't let anybody tell you that the other side is the side that's got a handle on freedom. We are the party of freedom, and we shouldn't be afraid to go out there and say it." And a lot of people on the right laughed at this, rightly so. And the best part was the response that came from Kafi Meh, who wrote in response, "Don't eat that, don't drink that, don't smoke that, don't drive that, don't live there, don't say that, don't write that, don't think that." And that's that. I mean, in one simple tweet, he summed up what I've been trying to say for the past few minutes, which is that the idea that anybody who's libertarian-minded could vote for a Democrat is just, it's absurd, because Democrats are micromanagers. They want to tell you what to say, what to think, what to eat, how to spend your money, how much of your money they should take. And granted, I'm not saying that Republicans are perfect. They're far from perfect. But if you accept the fact that we live in a two-party system and you want your vote to count, if you're a libertarian-minded person, you're better off, usually, almost always, voting Republican for this reason. So there's a brief introduction that should give you an idea of where I am politically and why. And I hope that wraps it up. But if you have any questions, you could always leave a comment, and maybe I'll address it in a future podcast. And the other thing to consider is that when it comes to that third party thing, it works on the other side too. I mean, in the same way that the Libertarian candidate can often siphon votes away from the Republican, the same thing can happen on the left between the Democrats and the Green Party. And you go all the way back to the 2000 election, and Ralph Nader, who ran as the Green Party candidate, was persona non grata for a long time after that election, because a lot of people on the left felt that he siphoned just enough votes away from Al Gore to hand the election to George W. Bush. And then even just in this past presidential election in 2016, Jill Stein took a lot of heat from the left, especially in the Rust Belt, in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, because people on the left felt that she siphoned off just enough of the vote from Hillary Clinton to hand Donald Trump a win in those states. And if you remember, in the months after the 2016 election, Jill Stein even got caught up in the whole Russia investigation. I mean, there were people who actually believed that Jill Stein had in some way worked with Putin. And there was even, there was a big controversy because somebody had discovered old video of her at a dinner where she was sitting at the same table as Putin. And so it became this whole thing where, obviously Jill Stein had worked with the Russians behind America's back to hand the 2016 election to Donald Trump, which is absolutely absurd. But, in politics, people often just will believe what they want to believe, whatever makes them feel better and helps them sleep at night. And that was certainly one of those cases. So anyway, that's the first section of this podcast. In the next section, I want to move on and talk about what's happening in the 2020 election with a specific eye to the Democratic candidates. So let's just do that. Okay, so looking at the 2020 field of Democratic candidates, the first thing that I want to talk about double standards for a minute here. And the first double standard that jumps to mind immediately is the number of candidates that they have running. If you think back to the Republican primary leading up to the 2016 election, the Republicans had 17 candidates. And whenever this came up, among sort of the people in the Democrat media complex, it was a joke. The Republican Party was mocked for having 17 candidates. And now, in the run-up to the 2020 election, there are over 20 Democrats running. And there are still more to come. I mean, just today, one candidate whose name escapes me because she's so unknown, just announced on Twitter today that she has reached the donor threshold to appear in the debates. And I looked at this woman's name and I was like, I follow politics for a living. I've never even heard of this woman before. So that's the first double standard. It's just the clown car of Democratic candidates that just keeps on growing. And nobody in the media seems to think that's funny anymore. which is kind of funny in and of itself. The second double standard that I want to talk about, we have to go back to 2008, the 2008 campaign. You may remember in 2008 when it was John McCain running against Barack Obama, that John McCain turned 72 the summer before the 2008 election. And his age was a subject that came up constantly in political news media and even among Democrats who were involved with the Obama campaign. And the line was the same. The drum that was beaten was the same all the time. John McCain is too old. John McCain is too old. He's got health issues. He's 72. That's too old to be president. And this came up over and over and over again. Well, now here we are in the run-up to the 2020 campaign, and the two Democratic frontrunners, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, are both older than John McCain was in 2008. So John McCain in 2008 was 72, and he was too old. And now here we are in the run-up to the 2020 election, and Joe Biden is 76 years old, and Bernie Sanders is 77 years old. And I probably wouldn't even have thought about this, except one day I was on Real Clear Politics, and there was a story, an opinion piece from CNN titled, "Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are not too old to be president." And so this whole flood of memories came back of the 2008 campaign and how everybody on the left said that John McCain was too old. So it's amazing to see how the standard changes. There was a headline in 2008 at Politico, which the headline was, "McCain's age is a legitimate issue." But now that, that might be a problem for Democrats, of course, no one's going to talk about that. And if they do talk about it, it'll be framed in such a way as Joe Biden and Bernie's age is not a legitimate issue, because that's just the way these things work. There was even an awful campaign ad, which was made by the Obama campaign, that mocked John McCain's age, and it even, in a sort of roundabout way, mocked his wartime disability, that affected his ability to raise his arms. And nobody said a word. Nobody said a word. But now, now age isn't an issue now, all of a sudden. Just amazing how that works out, isn't it? So anyway, moving on. I would say if the election was next week, if you pay attention to polling data, and the best source, I think, is Real Clear Politics. If you go to Real Clear Politics, right up at the top of their website, you'll see links to the Democratic primary, and then if you hover on that, a drop-down menu appears, and the very first one is their average of polls. And so you go to the average of polls, and what they do is just that. They take all of the polls that are available, and they average them together, and they produce a graph based on that average of polls. And if you look at that right now, Joe Biden is running away with it. He's way out in front, and no one else is even close. The only person who was coming close to him for a while was Bernie Sanders. But the moment that Joe Biden announced, the line for Bernie Sanders started to go down, and the line for Joe Biden started to go up, and now the divide is huge. And all the other candidates are way down at the bottom, polling in like the 7 or 8% or even much lower area. So the way it looks now, I would say if the election was next week, which of course it isn't, but if the election was next week, I would say that Biden would get the Democratic nomination. And if Biden gets the Democratic nomination, then according to the rules of the left, we already know who would have to take the second part of the ticket, the VP slot. Biden could not choose Beto or Pete Buttigieg as his running mate, because Democratic voters are simply not going to go for an all-white, all-male ticket. So it stands to reason that Biden would have to run with a woman, preferably a woman of color. And I don't think that he would run with Elizabeth Warren. I really don't. I think that his choice would be somebody like Kamala Harris, or maybe Stacey Abrams if she gets into the race. Although there was some speculation about that months ago, and Stacey Abrams basically put it to rest, saying, "Hey, if I run, I'm not going to run for second place." Now, that can change, of course, if it came down to it and Joe Biden got the nomination and he asked Abrams to be his running mate, she might say yes. But if the election was next week, my prediction would be that the ticket would be Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. Because according to the rules of the left, that's just the way it would have to be. That's what makes sense. Elizabeth Warren, you never know. Biden could pick Warren, but I don't think he will, just because I think that, and I'm saying this as somebody from Massachusetts, I really believe that Elizabeth Warren is damaged goods politically. I think that she took the bait from Trump. She did that whole stunt with the DNA test, which just blew up in her face politically. It couldn't have come out worse than it did. And I think it's hurt her. A few months ago, when Pete Buttigieg sort of burst onto the scene and was getting all kinds of attention from the media, he was polling higher than Warren. And Warren has been running for this forever. She's been eyeing this for God knows how long, despite her saying for months and months and months that she wasn't going to run for president. We all knew she was. And of course she is. But I think that really hurt her, the DNA test. And I just think that she's damaged goods. Now, she still has plenty of support on the left. There are a lot of people who support her. And she still has a lot of support from important places for Democrats like Hollywood and, the New York, D.C. Beltway crowd, and people in media who like her very much. But I think she's damaged goods. And I also think this is something I've been saying about Warren, again, as somebody from Massachusetts. I've been saying for a long time that I think that Democrats vastly overestimate Elizabeth Warren's appeal on a national stage. She can get elected here in Massachusetts, but I just don't see her playing to the middle of the country. I really don't. Even before the DNA test, but now after the DNA test debacle, certainly. I just don't see her. I don't see her pulling it off. So, again, that would be my prediction. Next week, if the election were next week, the Democratic ticket would be Biden and Harris. And, of course, the election is a long way from now. The Democratic National Convention is over a year away. So, in terms of politics, that might as well be like 1,000 years. So a lot can change between now and then, which is why I say if it was next week, just to hammer home that qualifier. One other thing I think is fascinating is how Beto O'Rourke has just faded completely. A new poll came out today for the state of New Hampshire, which is a really important primary state. And Beto O'Rourke is polling at 2% right now in New Hampshire, which is astounding because just a couple of months ago, he was the left's rock star candidate, and people were even calling him the white Obama. And now he is just gone. And I think it's partially because the left, and when I say the left, I mean the Democratic Party and their adherents and their allies in the media. I think that the left is so focused on beating Trump that they'll just discard anyone the minute that they think that they're no longer useful. So Beto looked like he was going to be useful, and everybody got behind him and was all excited. And then the minute that Buttigieg came out and sort of outflanked him on the hierarchy of intersectionality by virtue of the fact that he's gay, Beto just got thrown to the side. And you know what? If something happens in the next coming months where it makes Buttigieg sort of no longer useful, he'll be cast aside too. It's just it's almost like scratch tickets. I call them scratch ticket Democrats because that's what they are. Have you ever been into a gas station, which looks more like a casino because everybody in there is playing scratch tickets and they just buy them and then they go off to the side and they scratch them and maybe they win $10 and they go back to the counter and buy 2 more tickets and they can go on and do this for hours and hours and hours. I think that's kind of where the Democrats are right now, where left is that they're just scratching the ticket, hoping for that one thing that'll be a guarantee, that they'll say, okay, now we've got Trump where we want him. And until they get that, they're just going to keep using things up and throwing them away and using things up and throwing them away. And that's where I think Beto is. I think Beto O'Rourke has been tossed into the pile of loser scratch cards, that you find on a counter in a gas station because he's no longer useful. And particularly if Biden gets the nomination, then Beto is completely useless because he can't be the VP because he's a white guy. So it's very interesting to watch. And again, if you're interested in this sort of thing and you want to pay attention, I highly recommend using the resources at Real Clear Politics. They've got all of the tools there that you can sort of follow and drill down into this information. But it'll be very fascinating to see where this goes in the coming months. And again, nothing that I've said is set in stone because in terms of political time, the next year might as well be 1,000 years. So that's really all I have to say on that topic. I have one more topic that I want to speak with you about, and it's kind of a fun one. So give me a moment to just take a breather here, and then I'll go there. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do in this podcast episode is offer a movie recommendation because I really like movies and I enjoy recommending them to people. The movie that I'm going to recommend that you see is not a new film. I'm going to recommend that if you have not watched it in the age of Trump, I'm going to recommend that you go back and watch the 1980 film Caddyshack, because it takes on a whole new level of meaning in the age of Trump. Al Cervic, the classic character played by Rodney Dangerfield, is a deplorable. I mean, he just is in every way. I should clarify this a little bit. I should say that Al Cervic is the way that the Never Trumpers view the deplorables. And when you watch it, you can't help but view it through this lens. And to add even more to it, the Ted Knight character of the judge, he becomes like the Bill Kristol character. You know, Bill Kristol, who ran the now defunct Weekly Standard and now runs a website called The Bulwark, which is like a voice for all the Never Trumpers, a place for all the Never Trumpers to write about why they're Never Trump. The movie, as you're watching it, at least in my experience, and I had seen the film hundreds of times over the years, but when you watch it in the age of Trump, it takes on all kinds of new levels of meaning, and you just enjoy it more if you're interpreting it through this lens. It's actually kind of funny, and I won't spoil it for you. I just say, go back and watch the film. The other thing that's interesting about this movie is that it falls into a category with a lot of other films from that era as a movie that could not be made today. There are so many movies from like the 80s and 90s which you just could not make today, and Caddyshack is definitely one of them. Not only could you not make them, but you can't even screen some of these movies today. One of the things that I cover for Legal Insurrection is the sort of craziness that's happening in American higher education. And when you have students who are obsessed with things like microaggressions and they want safe spaces and, going back to the thing I talked about before, you can't say that, you can't think that. If you showed a film like Caddyshack on a college campus today, I mean, depending on the college, you would likely have protests. You'd have people out in front of the place where the film was being screened holding signs denouncing hate speech and, all this other stuff, even though they can't appreciate that it's from a different time and that it needs to just be met on its own terms, and seen through the lens of that time. It can't be appreciated on its own. Everything has to be measured, against the society that we live in now. But anyway, that would be my recommendation. Go back and watch Caddyshack and watch with a specific eye to Rodney Dangerfield as Al Cervic and the Judge Smales, who is the Bill Kristol character. And you'll see it in a whole new light. It's really fascinating. So anyway, I should say the other thing is it's almost like it inspired me. I wanted for a while after viewing it to start an organization called the Al Cervic Republicans. In the same way that in the early 2000s, there was such a thing as the South Park Republicans, people who discovered that they agreed with a lot of Republican values by watching South Park. This is a real thing. You can actually look that up on Wikipedia. There is an actual entry on Wikipedia for South Park Republicans. And in the same way, I think that there should be such a thing as Caddyshack Republicans. And I think I might be one. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this first episode of the Mike LaChance podcast. And I hope to have you tune in again when I try to do this again next week with another round of topics. Thanks very much. I hope you enjoy your weekend and keep it real.